and it's my honor to welcome you to this discussion about leading in the aftermath of a school shooting. No event shakes a community quite as hard as a school shooting. We're disturbed not just by the violence, but by the violation of a safe haven, a place where we send our children to grow into their best selves. Sadly, we have seen enough school shootings to recognize the pattern that follows. 25 of them in 2019 alone, according to Education Week, most of which no longer make the headlines. After parents retrieve their children and the cameras go off and the police relinquish the crime scene back to school, it is typically the principal who stands alone. The principal must collect the broken pieces of the community and restore them whole. The principal must find a way to fashion the new normal that acknowledges the tragedy without being defined by it. The principal musters up every bit of steadiness and compassion to return the school to its core business of learning. It's a very difficult and isolated position for any principal. And that's why NASSP created the Principal Recovery Network last year. All 20 of these principals' schools were shattered by gun violence. A few of these principals took a bullet themselves, and they exhibited the leadership required to put the pieces back together again. To borrow an expression from former Columbine principal Frank DeAngelis, who is on our panel today, each of these principals is a member of an exclusive club they never aspired to join. For the past year, the Principal Recovery Network has been a source of support for one another in the ongoing recovery process and to numerous other principals in the immediate aftermath of their school shootings. Like all of you, NASSP wishes such a network were not necessary. But since it is necessary, we are honored by the faith of these principals that they have placed in us as a steward of their stories and as a catalyst for outreach to their colleagues. You will meet several members on our panel today, but I would like all of the PRN members that are here today to stand and be recognized. Heroes. Thank you. This morning, all PRN members met with their members of Congress to discuss many of the issues you will hear from our panel. That recovery is an ongoing process. That school-based mental health resources are scarce as demands continue to grow. That they must attend to the needs, that we must attend to the needs of the adults in recovery as much as the children. That we must work at all levels of policy and practice to make sure that these 20 school leaders are the last to ever endure a school shooting. And in the meantime, even as shootings become more commonplace, we can never allow them to become normal. I am pleased to introduce you today to Mariah Balingit. Mariah Balingit from the Washington Post, who will moderate our panel today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to first introduce our distinguished panelists. We have Dr. George Roberts, who is currently the Community Superintendent for Baltimore County Public Schools. And he was the principal of Perry Hall High School when a student was shot and injured another student, or when a student shot and injured another student in 2012. We have Elizabeth Brown, who is the principal of Forest High in Marion County, Florida. She became principal just over a month after an active shooter incident there. We have Frank DeAngelis, who was the principal, was a staff member at Columbine High School in Littleton from 1979 to 2014, and was principal in 1996. And Greg Johnson has served as an educator at West Liberty Salem since 1997, and has been a principal since 2005. They had an active shooter situation in 2017. And I first wanted to start the discussion by asking each of you to describe briefly the incident that brought you to the Principal Recoveries Network, and maybe share with us one lesson that you learned in that experience.
So thank you, Ryan. And first I'd like to thank our colleagues on the network who stood, certainly who have been a support for me personally and a support for others around the country. So thank you for coming out and joining us. My incident was the very first day of school in August of 2012. So I always share when I talk about our incident that we all have that common experience of the first day of school, whether it's elementary, middle, high school, college, first day on a job. The clothes are pressed, everything's new, the grass is cut. I mean, it's an awesome day for educators as you welcome your kids and your staff back. About 3 hours into our very first day of school, we had a sophomore who the previous night had disassembled his father's shotgun. He went on YouTube, learned how to disassemble his father's shotgun, put it into a knapsack with 20 shell casings, proceeded to ride to school on the bus, go to his first 3 periods of class, and then when he went into the cafeteria, whatever triggered him, he went into the bathroom, assembled his shotgun, and came out and fired probably about 1 shot of the double-barrel shotgun, and it struck a direct shot into another student. No connection to the shooter, he just randomly fired into this student. As he was about to fire the second shot, a school counselor who happened to be in the cafeteria, wasn't his duty at that period, happened to be in just to look for a student to return a student ID badge, saw the first shot being fired, and because the gunman wasn't able to see him coming out of his right side, he was able to tackle him as the second shot went off, and luckily that shot went harmlessly into the ceiling of the cafeteria where there were about 500 kids at the time. So our school shooting happened in the cafeteria, first lunch period. So really one of the takeaways, and Dr. Hutton kind of alluded to this in her comments, 2 years later, I had a student for a college essay application write the very first sentence, and it's burned in my brain and I will never forget it. The first sentence of his application was "bang!" exclamation point. With 1 shot, the collective innocence of the room was gone forever. My school counseling chair ran into my office to say, "Georgia, look at this," and how powerful 2 years after the fact that this had on this particular student. And I share that to say a takeaway for me is, as we mentioned, that new normal. It was a collective innocence that was robbed from my kids, not just in the cafeteria who witnessed it, but within the entire community. And as we were moving in a direction, I always say that that path zigged forever, went a different path. And that community will always be a part of that community, won't define us, but it certainly is a part of it. So that's really the big takeaway for me, is that one act, and that took about 60 seconds, totally changed the dynamic of the community. And I think at this point, 8 years later, for the good in terms of bringing us closer together, but that's one of my big takeaways.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Brown, principal at Forest High School in Marion County. Thank you for being here. The alleged shooter entered the Forest High School campus on April 20th, which is also the anniversary of the Columbine High School shooting. He entered during our initial bringing in of the students for class and went into a restroom in the vicinity of our upstairs hallway, changed into tactical gear. He had disguised his weapon in a guitar case, and he loaded his weapon and exited the restroom, immediately shooting into the first classroom, seriously injuring 1 student. At that point in time, it was his perception that his gun had jammed, and as he was beginning to realize that, our SRO from the Marion County Sheriff's Office was very quickly on the scene, and our incident was ended very, very quickly with the shooter basically abandoning his plan and turning himself over to law enforcement. I took over as the principal a little over a month after that incident and began the healing process with the school community. The biggest lesson that I learned, and what I will always take away from this as a school leader, my very first task was to meet with student leadership and talk to them about what they wanted to see in the future for Forest High School. I met with them with their instructional advisor and sat back and just listened. And what I garnered for that conversation is that as the school leader, not only can we not assume what the healing process will be and the time frame for healing, but we also cannot predict We do not know triggers. We do not know what each student internalized. And so as the school leader, I have learned and tried to subscribe every day to listening to the student body, watching their behaviors and their actions, hearing their conversations in order to build morale and to build a happy and peaceful new normal for Forest High School, where that particular day is just a day and is not necessarily part of our history.
I'm Frank DeAngelis, and I was at Columbine High School. I started back in 1979 and retired in 2014, so I spent my entire career there. Wore many hats. I was an assistant football, head baseball, but more importantly, a history teacher, a dean of students, assistant principal. And I was in my third year as principal, and in April 20th, 1999, a beautiful Colorado spring day, and I was getting ready to go down to the cafeteria, and believe it or not, as a high school principal, I loved cafeteria duty, because it gave me a chance to go meet with the kids. But some interesting things happened that morning. I was in my office having a conversation with Kiki Leba, and he was a first-year teacher, and I was getting ready to offer him a job. And to this day, I still don't know if I offer him a job. He's still working at Columbine. But before I could offer him a job, my secretary came running towards the door, and I can remember so vividly, she face-planted in this little window. And she opened the door and she said, "Frank, there's been a report of gunfire." And it didn't register. I mean, Columbine High School is a school that was high-achieving dropout rate, 85% of our kids going on. And if you would have told me at Columbine could have happened at Columbine, I would have said, no, it happens at other places. And all of a sudden, I run out of my office, and the first thing that I'm thinking, this has to be a senior prank. I mean, we're about a month away from the seniors graduating. And all of a sudden, as I come out of my office, my worst nightmare became a reality, because from here, about 75 yards away, there's a gunman coming towards me. And it's interesting, what I learned later is I went through something known as fight, flight, and freeze. And everything seemed to slow down, and the fire alarm was so loud that we could not carry on a conversation, but I was able to block that out. In my mind, I thought I walked very slowly down the hallway, but I actually sprinted, and I had police officers saying, "Frank, why would you run towards the gunman?" And as educators, we're there to protect our kids, just like Dawn, who gave her life at Sandy Hook, Dave Sanders, who came out of the hallway to protect kids. I had 30 of my kids that were coming out of the locker room, girls that go to a PE class, unaware of what was happening. And there were some things that happened that day that I can't explain, I just have to accept. But one instance, these girls are unaware, and I knew if I could get them into the gymnasium, we would be safe until I could verify to get them outside. So everything's going as planned until I pull on the door in the gymnasium, and it was locked. The girls are screaming. We actually hear the boots of the gunman coming towards us, and the sounds of shots are getting closer. And I had a suit on that day, and I had 30 keys on a key ring. And I reached in my pocket. The first key I pulled out, and it stuck it in the door, and it opened it on the first try. And it was interesting. Last year was our 20-year remembrance, and some of those girls that were with me that day come in, and it was very emotional, and they start crying. And they sat their family in front of me, and they had their children, and they said, "Mr. D, thank you so much for finding that key, or I wouldn't have my family with me." And I had very little to do in finding that key that day. And it was at that point that I helped the police mobilize things we had to do. But one of the lasting impressions, something I was never prepared for, and again, this was 20 years ago, the only drills we did were fire drills. And we did not know about reunification, but they brought me down to the elementary school, and it was about 3 hours after everything was coming towards the end there, and the police were still on campus, and we had parents there meeting with their kids, and it was a reunification center. But something I was never prepared for with all my education is there were parents who came up to me and said, "Frank, did you see my son or daughter? They were in a math class or English class." And I had not, and I remember a father coming up saying, "Frank, for the last 4 hours, there have been school buses bringing kids, and we do not see any more school buses." And that's when a grief counselor came over to me and said, "Frank, you need to take these parents in there, family members in there, and tell them there's a good chance their kids lost their life in your school." And that's something that I have to live with for the rest of my life, because those kids walked in my building at 7 a.m. and they never returned home. And the thing that makes it even more difficult is the fact that they were killed by 2 of my kids. And it was that night that I couldn't go home. They were concerned about the safety and welfare of my wife and my kids, so I'm at my brother's house, and I made a promise that night that there was nothing I could do to bring back the 13, but I was going to continue to speak on their behalf. And this group that I am so privileged to work with, we all share this common bond. And in most cases, I reached out to a majority of the ones here, and the first question they asked is, they said, what do we think about? And I said, it's a step-by-step process. It's a marathon and not a sprint. And we take it day by day. And the other thing that is so important is people ask, when does it get back to normal? And it does, and it redefines. But at the same time, we can never become helpless and hopeless. And as educators, as psychologists, they're all of our kids. And I am so honored to be a part of this Principal Recovery Network and be able to work with them. And I think the takeaway for me, if I could share my entire story with you, what we were doing 20 years ago compared to what is happening now. And I know Elizabeth talked about the school resource officer going in immediately. On that day, the protocol was to secure the perimeter. And we had over 150 police officers responding, but they could not go in until SWAT arrived, and SWAT arrived an hour later. And now you look at the protocol, things we're doing, and I know we continue to hear about school shootings, but how many have been stopped because of things we have in place today? And I think that's what we need to concentrate on and build upon that. So once again, thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Hi, my name is Greg Johnson. I'm the high school, middle school principal at West Liberty Salem. This is my 15th year. We're a small rural school in Ohio. It's actually a K-12 building, so everybody in our district attends school in the same building. We graduate about 100 kids a year. We experienced our school shooting on January 20th of 2017, so I believe there's a lot going on here in D.C. that day. It was the day that President Trump was inaugurated. And we had a junior student who had brought a disassembled shotgun to school. He drove himself to school. He had disassembled it, put it in his backpack, had his little sister with him, acted normal, went into the restroom before school started, into the back stall where he sat down and meticulously put it back together. He also had a backpack full of ammunition with him. Bell rang at 7:35 to start the school day. I was down in the office trying to figure out how we were going to cover some classrooms where we were still waiting for some subs to show up. And everybody went into class. We had a group of students who were getting ready to go to a mock trial competition, and they were waiting in the hallway for their teacher. One of those students, a young man who was also a junior named Logan Cole, decided he needed to check his hair. He walked into the restroom and surprised our student who was our shooter. He was preparing to carry out his plan, and he still hasn't shared what that was. He had a self-made mask. And like I said, brought in a backpack full of ammunition. When Logan walked in, it startled the young man, and he fired 2 shots at Logan and direct hit from about 5 feet away. The first one struck Logan in the front, spun him around. The second one struck him in the back. The student then proceeded to go to the doorway and fire 3 shots into classroom doors across the hall. When he walked back into the restroom to grab his backpack, he stepped over Logan, who looked up at him and was still alive and was looking at him. And the young man, he said, "What, you're not dead?" And Logan said, "No, I'm not." At that point, the shooter started to second guess what he was doing. And Logan started to talk to him about putting the gun down and getting help. To the point where, after he reloaded, our shooter turned the gun on himself, and Logan stopped him and told him, "Stop! You don't need to do this. You haven't killed anybody yet. Go get me help." After about 3 or 4 minutes of the two of them in the restroom together, myself and another administrator, we had heard the report that there was a shooting in the high school wing. From the hallway, we could hear the two of them talking. It was obvious that somebody had a gun and somebody didn't. And we entered the restroom. As my assistant principal walked in and asked Logan if he was okay, the other student heard him and said, "I'm sorry, Coach," and put the gun down and slid it on the floor towards us. Our assistant principal had been both his wrestling coach and his football coach. So from that point on, it was that's when our recovery effort started, was from that moment on. In the meantime, before we got there, 400 high school and middle school students had busted out windows, and we're all on one floor, so they were able to evacuate through windows and run through muddy cornfields to neighboring farmhouses a half to 3/4 to a mile away, and another 250 students had remained in the building. I guess my one takeaway that I got from that over the last 3 years, it's just been, I guess I've learned it over and over again, is I think lots of times we talk about mass shootings and mass casualties, but a school shooting is also a mass survivor event. And to be honest, Logan has made a miraculous recovery, and I think that in itself allowed our community to heal quickly and to heal effectively in a lot of ways. He missed about a month of school and then he came back. So we still had Logan, and many times as we've struggled, we've said, just think, what would this be like without Logan? But over the last 3 years, I've learned that every one of those students and teachers, and I think sometimes we forget about the impact on the faculty, but every one of those students and teachers are survivors of a mass shooting, and with that comes anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, just lots of other issues, and I'd say I have become much more aware of how trauma can impact students, how trauma can impact people. And I was reading recently about different traumas and how different traumas can affect young people. But one factor that really comes into play is, to what degree did that person think that their life was in danger? And I can say those 400 students that evacuated through our windows and ran through fields 100% believed that their life was in danger, and that other than the people they could see, everybody else was dead. Eventually they learned that nobody died. But that doesn't undo what happened inside their brain during that time. So that was kind of the main takeaway for me over the last 3 years.
Wow, thank you so much for those really powerful stories. When we spoke before, one of the things that it's a point that's difficult to make when we're talking about school shootings, but schools are still overwhelmingly one of the safest places for children to be, even in the wake of a shooting. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between, I think one of the things I've learned to appreciate, though, is that there's a difference between being safe, looking at the numbers, knowing statistically you're safe, and feeling safe. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenge in aligning those two pieces of safety. What do you need to help students feel safe outside of the hardening of schools and adding police officers? And do those measures always help students feel safer?
I think what our schools are doing now, for parents and teachers, you see cameras, you see gates and things of that nature, and it's something visible. But sometimes the things that are difficult to measure is creating that environment, that inclusive environment. In a kid, you could have the best curriculum program, but if a kid does not feel safe, he's going to have a very difficult time learning. And I think that's one of the most important things as we continue to look at safety measures to harden the school as far as locked doors, cameras, and things of that nature, but don't estimate the importance of those adults in the school and having programs that could reach out. What I look at is the kids from Columbine. I saw pictures when they were young little kids, when their soccer uniforms, missing teeth, and then I saw a guy pointing a gun at me. And what happened from that period of time when they were young until they walked through those doors? Did we miss something? And I think that's so important, having that adult in there that kids feel comfortable going to.
I agree with Frank on that. So much of our healing process depends on strong leadership within the school. That is not just at the administrative level. It is also in each of the classrooms. And I'm very proud to be the leader of strong teacher leaders, that compassion and their understanding of what the students went through that day resonates in their classroom without continuously having to be a verbal discussion. Our students feel safe because our staff and our administrative team have created a culture where they can go and talk to people and let us know if they don't feel safe and why don't they feel safe. So as a lot of things in education revert back to the relationship of the adults in the building with the students and our belief in them that they can succeed, that this did not impede their success as students, and that strong leadership, first at the admin level, but also at the teacher level, is a major important part of students feeling safe and feeling like they can verbally express themselves if they don't feel safe.
The only thing I would add to those two wonderful responses is really that sense of ownership, which is really, I think, what we're hearing. immediately after our event, which one of the things that struck me was the way our students and our staff took ownership of the school. Everyone had a common goal. Often in high schools, in schools, kids are working towards different paths. Some are going to career, some are going to college, some are going to military, and teachers teach their subject. And kind of everyone, though in the same building with similar expectations, everyone has kind of their lane that they work in and that they get educated in. After that event, after our shooting, everyone was focused on recovering. Everybody was focused on making sure this didn't define our community. So really that, on top of relationships, it was everyone from the 9th grader to the 12th grader, from the first-year teacher to the 30-year teacher, with that one common goal of how are we going to heal and how are we going to move forward.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Senator Blumenthal has joined us and is going to give some remarks.
I'm Richard Blumenthal. I'm the senator from Connecticut. I understand Kathy Gambos is here from the Sandy Hook Elementary School. I don't know whether any other principals are here. But thank you so much for the great work that you're doing, for the panelists, an expert, really terrific group who are here today. I'm inspired by local educators like yourselves who grapple with these issues firsthand every day through the eyes and ears of children, who endure the fear and apprehension that come with this issue of guns and violence. I have dedicated a good part of the last 3 decades to this issue, first as Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, where I championed the ban on assault weapons back in the early 90s, when it was far less well known as a source of problems than it is today. And by the way, that law was upheld. I not only championed the law, but then defended it when it was challenged in the courts. Many of the same arguments brought against that ban then, and we overcame those legal challenges, and I argued it all the way to the state Supreme Court. But we are making progress. We've made progress since then. We're making progress now. And I hope that your advocacy and your commitment will help us achieve reforms like universal background checks, emergency risk protection orders. We are, in fact, close to a consensus, bipartisan agreement on those 2 measures. And then a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, background checks on ammunition, safe storage measures, an end to the sweetheart deal that gives gun manufacturers absolute immunity, unique immunity against any kind of legal responsibility. These kinds of measures are gaining traction with the American public. And in the last federal election in 2018, we saw the results when members of Congress were elected, making gun violence an issue, not just reacting to questions, but proactively making it an issue. So gun violence prevention was on the ballot, and it won. Still, at the local level, where you deal with your students and your families, the apprehension is no less real. And so I welcome this kind of conversation. I think sharing your wisdom is very much needed. And I hope that my office and I and my colleagues can benefit from that wisdom. And I hope that you will feel free to contact me when you think I can make a difference in any way in helping you with the great work that you're doing. So thanks for letting me interrupt. I apologize, and enjoy the day in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again. I wanted to let you.
I think just to add to that a little bit, and we also, our school was about 25 years old at the time of the shooting. And we had gone through a recent remodel and made some improvements, but we were very cognizant and we were listening to our students because, like you said in the question, there's that desire to make your building safer, and then there's that desire for your students to feel safe. And I think students coming back into a building after a shooting obviously have a different perspective than students walking into a building that hasn't experienced a shooting. So we listened to our students, and we were able to find many ways to make our students feel safer. We retrofitted windows so that we had an egress window in every classroom. That wasn't the case at the time. We added some bullet-resistant film on the glass entryways that wasn't there at the time. We added some other door locks. So we did those things, and as I've had a chance to speak to other principals, that seems to be what they're asking for, what the kind of advice. But I'm always quick to follow it up with the personnel side of it. We were able to bring in a school resource officer that we didn't have before. We were able to hire a third school counselor, which we didn't have before. So going back to my 3 colleagues, those relationships, and I think our story is a great example of that. Logan's relationship with his classmate, and then that classmate, our shooter's relationship with his coach, those relationships are hugely important, and that's something that we're going to continue to strive to improve, is fostering those strong relationships.
Yeah, that's definitely something that struck me about that story, is we often hear that relationships are important, and that's an obvious and concrete, very compelling example of that being the case. I wanted to talk a little bit about mental health resources, and we had talked a little bit before about the challenges that you've experienced in connecting your students and sometimes your staff with the mental health resources you need. Can you talk a little bit about some of the barriers you've encountered in getting your students what they need in terms of mental health resources?
When you begin to talk about resources for mental health, they're with the guidance counselors at a high school level, and that's what I can specifically speak to. There are so many tasks that they take care of each day. As a principal, I look to them to lead and guide our students academically, keep a thumb on their students' progress, their particular caseload, making sure that they're achieving in the classroom, helping them decide college and career major decisions, helping them write scholarships. There is so much on their plate, and I venture to guess that all of us are very appreciative of our guidance counselors and the job that they do. They truly are unspoken heroes. But what our students need in the aftermath of a shooting is actual mental therapy. When they need to talk about triggers or things that have happened in the school day that have brought them back to that moment, they need someone immediate. And that just is not always available. The National Association of School Counselors suggests 1 counselor per every 250 students. And most of our high schools, and I venture to say at least through the state of Florida, if not nationwide, are functioning at a much lower ratio than that. And so we as a group are very cognizant and very willing to speak on behalf of needing more school counselors to offset the tasks that are already on their plate so that we can mentally assist our students through these incidents. But not only that, be proactive in keeping these incidents from happening. The particular county that I serve is very forward-thinking with threat assessment and mental health assessments, and even then our counselors have to stop and make time to make sure that we are doing that. And extra counselors that are specifically trained in trauma-informed school practices would be extremely helpful, not just for our schools that have been through it, but for every school, because there is no school that is exempt from a possible violent act on their campus.
Well, and I recall, too, you shared with me an incident, or there was a lockdown at your school. Mm-hmm. And can you describe sort of what you learned from that most recent incident?
I will humbly say that what I learned from it is my perception of the level of healing of my students was completely wrong. That was the first time that we as a school, and it was a very minor incident, but our SRO, who has a very solid working relationship with myself and our admin team, felt like it was necessary for us to go into a lockdown mode because we had a report of a possible intruder on campus. And in that moment, we began to realize that that was a trigger for students. And immediately thereafter, the parent phone calls, the community reaching out and saying, you know, my student was traumatized by just the sights and sounds of that particular incident, that they knew it was not a drill. As a school leader, I make very sure that our students and our community know that we are about to drill. And so they knew immediately it was not a drill, and we began to realize that even almost 2 years after the fact, there are still those resonating triggers within our students and our guidance staff. They are amazing, and they were immediately on deck with our students, but there was only 5 of them. And so I'm positive that there were students that felt like they needed to talk to someone that did not want to burden an already busy guidance counselor in that moment. We needed more help in that moment.
Yeah, I would add to that from a practical perspective, and NASSP is really out front in supporting legislation at the federal level to provide funding for exactly those types of staff, professional school counselors, social workers, pupil personnel workers, those staff and professionals who are specifically trained to work with adults and children on mental health issues and identification issues and support issues over a sustained period of time. So really what we need more at our district level are more of those professionally trained staff who can work with students and adults, certainly as all of us in the room as principals have gone through. It's not just the children or the staff, it's the parents as well who are going through the trauma. So it's the trauma-informed instruction within the schoolhouse, but then how do we partner at the federal and state and district level around the community aspects of support? How do we partner with our local hospitals? How do we partner with our local psychiatric hospitals or our counseling services at this public level and at the private level? And then lastly, how do we incentivize today's high schoolers and college youth to go into those professions? Is it a matter of increasing pay or making the job more attractive in whatever way possible to increase the bench, as they say, for professionals who are enticed to go work, whether it be a large district, small district, rural, middle of the country, on the coast of the country, wherever it may be, to really come in and want to work with students and their mental needs and their mental supports.
I think another thing that jumps out to me in our experience is there's also the education component and just educating our students and educating our staff and the language that we use. I know I was guilty the first day that we returned back to school of singing the praises of our student body and praising them for being so strong and so resilient and so tough. And over time, I learned how to change that message a little bit, and I learned how to share my story a little bit more. Resiliency doesn't mean that I can handle this on my own and I'm not asking for help. I think we had a lot of students and staff members who felt like we walked out of our situation saying, hey, nobody died, we're in good shape, I can handle this. And weeks and months and even years later, I think that's the group or the student, the teacher that worries me the most is the one that's just trying to deal with it on their own, and they're not comfortable going and asking for help and talking to their guidance counselor, going to, and that extends to staff too. I know for me personally, it took 2 years before some close friends convinced me that, Greg, you're not handling this well. Yeah, you're surviving, but we need a principal at the top of his game, not a principal that's doing okay. So for me, it took 2 years before I went to begin counseling, and that's been helpful to me. And I think being able to share that with my staff and being able to share that with my students has been helpful. So if I could go back to the start, I think we would have done a better job educating our students and our teachers on some trauma-informed practices. And here's what we can't say. Here's what to expect, because everybody's journey is different. But don't be surprised if 1 month from now, here's how you're feeling, or 3 months from now, here's how you're feeling, or a year from now. So using that language and educating our staff and students about mental health and about how we all respond to trauma was something that I took away from our experience.
And I think he brings up a key point. We could all experience the same event, but how we deal with it differently. And there are some people that want to talk about it, others that are saying, as soon as I get back to doing what I was doing, that gets me back to normal. And that was probably the most difficult thing for me, dealing with 2,000 students, 150 staff members, people who are in different places. And on a personal note, the best piece of advice that I received as educators, as leaders of the school, I had a Vietnam veteran who told me, if you don't help yourself, you can't help others. And I would not have been able to continue that journey if I did not get into counseling, because I think so many times as a leader, you feel you have to be strong for everyone else, you have to be there, but you also need to take care of yourself. And one of the things that I'm really working on within the state of Colorado, I know all the law enforcement agents that were at that school that day had to go through some type of debriefing before they went back to work. We had 150 staff members that we did not, I mean, we talked to them, but we put them right back in the classroom with the kids. And it would have been nice that if they would have sat down with psychologists to say, Frank, I'm a little concerned about this, we need to provide support, and that's something that I think we really need to look for, to have that support system for all staff members. And he did a great job of talking. I can say 20 years out, I think people feel that if they make it through the first year anniversary, 3 years, but we are dealing with students now. We just recently at Columbine had 2 suicide of kids that were there in 1999, that this journey of healing, it was up and down, and that's one of the things now. Money runs out. How do we continue to help these kids 10 to 15 years down the road?
And what are some of the challenges that people from the outside maybe don't know about? For example, we talked a little bit before about what you experience with personnel and turnover. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that people might not be aware of?
Someone who is a friend of the National Association of Secondary School Principals was Bill Bond, and he was a principal at Heath High School in Paducah. And he called me and he said, save my number. He said, right now you don't even know what you need. And so I called him, and my biggest concern is that very issue, what kind of turnover you're going to have. Because what happens in situations, if you are a survivor of 9/11, you can decide to go back to that site. If you survive, you can decide. But any person who walked back in that school had to relive everything they experienced that day. And there were triggers. And one of the things I was concerned about was staff maintaining or retaining the staff. And he said, Frank, I can tell you within 4 years he had over a 75% turnover. And I said, that doesn't happen at Columbine. But to my disbelief, we all decided to stay together with our kids until the freshmen graduated, which was the class of 2002. But after that, we had a 50% turnover. And they said, Frank, I'm telling you, when I'm off in the summer, I don't feel anxiety. I'm not having some of these reactions. And so we need to leave. And we saw an increase in the number of people that retired early, and we saw an increase in people that went to other places. So it's a true effect, the impact that it does have on people and the staff.
Yeah, I would, to really dovetail on Frank's comments, I think someone from the outside, what they may not realize is the length of the recovery. And Greg really mentioned it. It's, you know, he's 2 to 3 years into his, and we have varied times on this panel within the room to the principals who went through their shootings. What we really need is that understanding that recovery can take 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So when we look at what really this building and this city can do for us is really providing those funds and providing those resources to allow communities to have sustained support and not just assume, well, it's a year, or it's a 2 years, or it's a 3 years, and really you're not moving on yet, what's going on? It's nothing like that. And whether 3 of us didn't have fatalities, 1 of us did, and really if you asked any of the other 17, 20 principals in the room, the number of fatalities varies, or there weren't any, fortunately, but it's still a year-long process. So when we look at the Project SERVE legislation that's going through and is up for reauthorization, and that request for an increase in resources for Project SERVE, that is something that I think most of us took advantage of, not all of us took advantage of as principals, but really increasing those resources for Project SERVE so it can sustain over, frankly, as long as it's needed. As long as that community says we need it, then they need it, versus putting kind of a time frame on it.
I think one thing that Frank shared last year when I met him that really resonated with me is that your response isn't proportional to your level of tragedy. And I think some of us, especially a principal of a school where we didn't have a fatality, I got to be honest, I sit there and I look at some of my colleagues and I think, I can't imagine what that would be like. I mean, our students are struggling and nobody died. And Frank was very quick to point out that it's not proportional. Don't don't discredit what you and your students are experiencing just because nobody died, and don't compare 1 or 2 fatalities versus more. Really just accept the experience that happened to your students, to your staff, to your school, and deal with that. I think some other things that were surprising to me is, and I know some of our neighboring districts didn't understand, but we were very intentional about listening to our students and what things were the triggers, and things that I wouldn't have predicted. So, we made sure we didn't have any balloons at homecoming and prom that came up. We changed the way we started our races for track meets that spring. Our students couldn't handle the sound of gunfire, so we didn't use a starting pistol. So we listened to those things and made changes to protect those students.
I think for someone from the outside looking in, there is a process of healing that my other 3 colleagues have very succinctly described as undetermined. And I believe that from the outside looking in, and I was from the outside looking in until I took over the school a month after the fact, you have to trust the process. And in trusting the process, you have to trust the students. And you have to trust your staff, and you have to listen to what they need. And then our voices are the voices that can come out and say, this is what we still need. Don't forget about us just because it seems to, the term commonplace seems to be combined with active shooter incidents. There is nothing commonplace about the healing process, and lawmakers' support and continuing that Project SERVE funding and continuing to look into funding avenues for extra mental health training and extra mental health professionals on our campus, that is part of the process, and that is a very important part of the healing. In fact, for Forest High School, I can say it's probably the most important part of the healing. So as a school leader, speaking to those that are wondering, what is it really like when you walk into your school, trust the process, because we are in the process of healing and having the conversations with Frank that we've been able to have. I know that process is going to be long-lived. So don't forget that you have schools all across the nation that are still in this process and need the support.
Well, I wanted to ask a question that might elicit some advice for the, thank goodness, vast majority of principals who will never join the network, principals who might not experience any kind of violent incident in their school. What I find interesting, though, is that some of the reactions we're finding are also causing trauma for students. Sometimes the repeated lockdowns, the lockdown drills, and just seeing the headlines, the media coverage, all of that is making students in places that are far away from any of your schools feel unsafe when perhaps they don't need to. Where would you advise, if principals and school boards have limited resources, where would you advise they put those resources, or what would you advise they put those resources towards to help students feel safe?
I think one of the things, and certainly looking back to my incident, was the training on how to respond to an emergency. That emergency could certainly be a shooting. That emergency could be a weather-related emergency. It could be any number of emergencies. So when we talk about limited resources in our specific school districts, it really should be placed in, if you're looking at programs, research-based programs that support students' emotional well-being, students' physical well-being, that really wraps around them, metaphorically, to help them understand that when an emergency occurs in the building, this is how to react. But when you look at the preventive side, it's also things like conscious discipline and restorative justice and restorative practices that allow students a way to use their language to solve issues. So instead of going to YouTube to learn how to disassemble a shotgun, which 2 of our students did, it's going to the person or going to a trusted adult to say, hey, this is my issue with whomever, and how do we do that? So I think with limited resources, it's how do we support and identify and really train our students from a very young age. I'm talking kindergarten, first grade, on how to interact. But then as they matriculate through, how do we then also account for their physical well-being to make sure that they know when this happens, this is what you're supposed to do?
I think kind of from the training and the drilling perspective, I know it differs from state to state. We have different requirements, but our school was an Alice-trained school. That was just the tactics that we used as far as training our students. And after a shooting, we were still required by our state to have drills. We still, even that same school year, we had to have an active shooter drill. And we used the argument that we don't need a drill, we already did it. That didn't matter. We had to have an active shooter drill. But it caused us to, and I've heard other colleagues use the term, we had to carry out our drills with kids' gloves on. And I really think, and what I've tried to share with others, is I think those things that we do to make a drill less surprising, less scary, less traumatic, isn't only good for our students, but I think I've tried to share with other principals, I think that's a lesson for all principals. Students aren't going to be safer just because they were trained in a scary environment during that training. We set up our drills more as thinking drills, a lot of tabletop discussions with high school, middle school students, and we use common sense. A drill looks much different at the elementary level than it does the middle school level, than it does the high school level. What I felt in our school, one of the reasons why our students were able to evacuate is because we made an announcement from the high school that there was a school shooting 3 minutes after the first shots were fired. Our students were already out of the building. They weren't waiting on somebody to tell them what to do. I think training your students to be able to think for themselves, whether they have a teacher in the room with them or a substitute teacher, or if they're at the shopping mall, or if they're at the movie theater, training our students to think and advocate for themselves, and to be able to, even in a traumatic, stressful situation, think clearly what option makes sense for me right now is a key. And so I think we announce our fire drills. We send information home to parents before we're going to do a lockdown or an evacuation drill. We explain it to students ahead of time. We use language that we have vetted, we have discussed with each other to make sure that we don't feel like it's going to be traumatizing. And we have our students, thanks to our guidance counselors, we have our students that we are already worried about. And we go to them ahead of time and say, hey, we're going to have a drill on Wednesday. Here's what it's going to look like. Is this something where you think you want to participate? Would you rather stay in the guidance office? Have your parents call me. If it's a day where maybe you should stay home, we can discuss that. I think those things aren't only good for our schools. I think that's something that all building principals can learn from. And I know different schools are limited by state law and what they have to do. But I think we can be aware of our student needs and still practice and train for their safety.
And I think, what I state, it's not to scare, it's to prepare. And I think the thing that I learned out as an educator, a lot of times law enforcement and educators, they want to prepare to be safe, but it's the manner in which they deliver the message. And I know there are times that I've worked with school resource officers, and they deliver a message to educators that you can just see the look on educators' faces saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. And I was invited to a conference in Ohio, and they were going to do an active shooter drill, and they wanted me to observe. They actually had kids from the drama department that had blood all over their face, blood dripping out, and these teachers and administrators were just freaking out, and they looked at me, and it got to me, and they said, what did you think? And I said, there's other ways to prepare your staff than to have them walk over bodies that are bleeding and things of that nature. And I think these partnerships need to be developed with law enforcement saying, as educators, this is what we need. We do have to prepare. But I was shocked yesterday in talking to my esteemed colleagues. There's some of these places, they have to do some type of drill every month. And I think, what is that doing for kids? And we got to look at what's in the best interest of kids and staff. And, one of the things that I was concerned with some of these drills is all of a sudden you do these drills and then you put teachers back in the classroom and they have to teach the rest of the day. And so we got to look at all of these things, and hopefully you can start a dialogue with law enforcement, your security directors that are making these decisions.
I wholeheartedly agree with what each of these colleagues has said. I'm actually from the state of Florida, where the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas law does require us to have an active assailant drill monthly as well as a fire drill monthly. And so as my team and I began to come to the table after given the directive of what we had to do to coagulate our plan and solidify our plan for our school, it was very important for us to bring all voices to the table. I have a trusted group of community stakeholders made up of parents and business owners. I brought them to the table, brought teachers to the table, brought students to the table on what they needed from us as school leaders to make these drills successful, to prepare them and not to scare them. And I listened to those voices, and we plan our drills very transparently with a maximum amount of communication even during the drill, as Greg mentioned. But I think that one of the things that principals, and I think I speak pretty readily for the Principal Recovery Network, we hate the term limited resources, because when we come down to the moment, we don't have the right to say that to a parent. Frank has already mentioned that he was thrown into a situation where he had to deliver the news to parents that their children were not coming home, and they don't care about limited resources in that moment. My esteemed colleague, Ty Thompson, the former principal at Marjorie Stoneman, has a group of parents that do not want to hear about limited resources. And so as we begin to work under the confines of each of the state laws and whatever that law requires, I think it's extremely important that while we are bringing all voices to the table to maintain a school safety plan that is transparent and communicative with our school community, that our voices are also heard at a higher level, that we can receive more resources to make these drills and prepare our teachers and our staffs from beginning to end. After every drill, our guidance counselors' doors are open. I receive parent phone calls. We take a moment to regroup, and to have more resources in that moment can make or break a school safety plan, quite honestly.
And if I could just add one thing, also Mike from Chardon, we had a conversation yesterday, and we do a pretty good job during the day of safety features, but at high schools where they're open until 10, 11 o'clock at night, what safety precautions do you have in place for kids that are at play practice, games and that thing, if you have to go into a lockout? And so don't underestimate training that night crew also to be there. And I think, I'm not sure how good of it, we don't do a very good job in Colorado, and that's one of the areas that's a concern of mine.
I wanted to go back to the to talking about teachers and what they experience in the aftermath of this and the things that they need. I wanted to see, were teachers getting what they needed in the aftermath of the incidents you went through? And if they weren't, what was the consequence of that?
I'm thinking of the teacher who locked herself with 3 to 4 students in a closet with no lights in the dark, about 2 hours until the building was cleared and students were exited. So whenever I think about that question, I think of her, and I think of those students, and what do they need? And even 8 years later, what does she need, and what do the students need? And I go back to my earlier response. She, in communicating with her and others who didn't know what was going on, really was in 2012 that the social media wasn't as prevalent and explosive as it is now. It was just kind of starting around that 2010 period. So there was information getting out, but not a lot. So it's that sustained support. In the immediate, she needed, and my staff needed, just to know somebody was there. And I go back to that Project Serve opportunity where I could hire grief counselors. I could hire temporary contractual staff for the rest of the year, because my incident was in August. I had the full rest of the year to go through. So I was able to hire those contracted services to support. So in the immediate, it was my staff knowing that there was someone there they could talk to. But as the years went on, and as those funds diminished, and as those resources went away, I started learning that staff were still coming to me. They would say, George, you know what, I'm not sure why, but I was at the stoplight and I just started crying. And I don't know why. And again, this was a year, 2 years, 3 years later. I still get texts in school shootings from staff 8 years later when there's another shooting in the nation. Just checking in, how are you? Is there anything that you need? Whether it's to me or I'm reaching out to them. So it really is, in some ways, just knowing somebody is there. It's that common experience, but also having the real resources available over the long haul that I've noticed some of my staff still needing, whether it's professional support or it's just someone who was in that space at that time who can just bend an ear for 5 to 10 minutes to get it out of their system.
And I think one of the things that we experienced, because we were new at this, is we put teachers back in the classroom without the understanding of meeting the needs of the kids, because they were not comprehending the same manner they were prior to. They had to change the curriculum. For example, being a social studies teacher, if they showed a videotape of a World War I or World War II and there was a gunshot, the kids went into panic mode. And so I think educating the teachers, stating, you know, things are going to be different than what they were prior, and this is what you have to be aware of, how the brain develops certain emotions. I mean, a door slams in the middle of the day, and the kids and the teachers are in trouble. And one of the things that we did that was pretty effective, our school district did give us the resources. We had a pool of substitute teachers, and there were teachers that went into the class, seemed to be doing fairly well, but there would be an event, and then they could no longer handle it. But the fine line, and one of the most difficult things for me as a principal, if that same teacher is having this reaction week after week, month after month, and I think that's when you need to have the conversation, would a placement at a different school help be better for you and the kids? And those are some tough discussions.
For my staff, we did not have fatalities, and the actual incident was very quick. And so I believe that at times it has been trivialized, the impact that it had on the staff members, specifically in that hallway. And I can only revert back to a conversation that I had with a staff member, very strong teacher, very strong individual, that is the teacher whose classroom was shot into. And one of the things that I remember she shared out, and she does not share often, was that her counseling, she has far gone past what is offered at the district level and what our district is able to monetarily offer for our teachers. And she wants to continue with that counseling. She wants to be in control of her healing, not only from this incident, but just moving forward as a successful educator in the classroom. And the cost is enormous. And so that sometimes is very prohibitive to teachers that are trying to continue in the classroom with our students, be strong for the students during the day, because we by nature as educators are going to remain strong for our students all day long. But when it's time for that self-care, do they have the availability and can they afford to continue to go through the mental health therapy or counseling that they need without it becoming prohibitive to their lives with spouses and children and house mortgages and all of those expenses? You know, it becomes a situation where they have to weigh their priorities. And unfortunately, we have teachers that have been through active shooter incidents that are having to choose between making car payments or getting the mental health that they need. And so those resources and that focus on providing the help that they need is just as important as providing the help for students.
I think it's a very difficult question. And like we talked about with students and how students heal differently and respond differently, the same definitely applies to teachers. And they also have a desire for privacy. And, you know, we have teachers that they don't want to discuss it at school. If they want help or need help, they'll go on their own. And I know for me personally, I struggled with trying to do what's right for every individual. So, you know, at a staff meeting 3 months after the shooting, I've got 50% of my staff that the last thing they want me to bring up is the shooting. And I've got others that that's fine if we do or if we don't, and I've got others that that's what they need to hear. So what we tried to do, and I looking back, I feel like, especially during that first year, I don't think we did a very good job of reaching out to our teaching staff. I think we talked that I underestimated the impact that it was having and did have on our teaching staff. But like George said, just trying to be open to let the staff know that you are a listening ear. Because, like it or not, all eyes are on the principal. All eyes are on the leader of the building. So trying to let the teachers know that that they can come and speak to me and that we could talk about it is a good thing. I think once I was able to share some of my own struggles with my staff, I think that helped out a lot. That kind of broke down some walls. And it was helpful. And then the final thing for us in Ohio, one thing that I am very thankful for is part of our Attorney General's office. They have a Victim of Violent Crime Fund, and they didn't wait for us to contact them. They contacted us to share the process of how you can be reimbursed for not only some of that counseling care, but also even mileage to get there. And it applies to staff members and students within your building. So that was something that was a huge help for us and for those teachers, because in many cases, that is a barrier. Like, I don't want to pay for it. It probably won't be covered by insurance. I don't want to pay for it. So knowing that that safety net is out there was very helpful.
And I wanted to open it up for questions, and also if any of the members of the Principals Recovery Network wanted to weigh in at all, had any thoughts that they wanted to share. I wanted to open up the floor for that too. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I actually just had a quick question in regards to student recovery after an incident. Has there been any effort made has there been any... Hello? Ah, perfect. Has there been any effort made in your experience to involve... I don't think this is working. I'll just speak loudly.
There you go.
Has there been any effort made to include parents in the recovery efforts of, like, the students? Like training for the parents or anything of sorts?
Yeah. So for my incident, it was actually, and was related earlier, shared earlier, the key was students. Our lives are dedicated to students, so it was really listening to that student voice. But a close second, a 1A, part of our recovery was, in my community, was the parents. So my door was open to our student leaders, our students coming in or anonymously leaving, hey, this is what I would like to see, but also from parents whose children were in the space when it happened, or those who were locked down in the classroom for that period of time. So in terms of our recovery over the years following, it was really, I would say, a joint effort, a true joint effort between the parents and the students to make sure, because you can't have one without the other. And I would argue you need the students first, because it's the students who are going to go home and tell mom and dad or their guardian, hey, this is what we need. So it was that student voice first, then really the parents, and then from there, it was just bringing in other sources.
It was real interesting in talking to some of the parents now, 20 years out. They wish they would have been more persistent in getting their kids help. Because what the kids said after the event, they kind of sheltered themselves. And it's almost like a war veteran who doesn't want to share his or her experience. And these kids did not want to share it with their parents. And I can remember having an assembly with the kids saying, this is not going to make sense until you become parents. And I said, that better not happen anytime soon. But when your parents heard there were gunshots fired at Columbine High School, their heart started racing. And you need to go home, and they need you as much as you need them. And this is not going to make sense. And it's really amazing. I've had kids now that are 38-year-old adults, and they're telling me for the first time they understood that message that now they're parents. And so it's that partnership in letting parents know that these resources are out there for their kids.
And as far as reaching out to the parents, an open line of communication with school leadership is a major advantage for our parents. I have had several groups of parents come in, just asked for time face-to-face with me, that have described in detail exactly what they felt in the moments after finding out that there was an active shooter on the campus at Forest High School until the moments that they were unified with their student at a location off of the school campus. And listening to their input has led me to form the Community Stakeholder Council that meets with me on a quarterly basis. There are parent voices involved with that particular community stakeholder. But what I would really like to see is use of funding and use of the resources that we have from the state and national level to be able to bring in those mental health counselors to serve families. Because as George very frankly said, this is a joint effort. We heal students, but we do need to heal parents, and we do need to heal staff. And being able to bring in those mental health therapists and counselors that are trauma trained would be a major step in the right direction to heal entire school communities, not just hit and miss pieces along the way.
One example in our school, and these would not be for the parents who I would say were deeply struggling with trauma, but there were so many parents that wanted to do something. They wanted to do something to be a part of the healing process, and that's a challenge sometimes as a principal to try to figure out how to honor those wants and desires. But you can't let every parent do everything they want to do. But we were able to put a committee together of a group of parents that were able to plan and host a breakfast for our students. And then one thing that was great for our staff is they wanted to do something big and special for the staff. So they put together kind of an evening celebration with to raise money for scholarship fund, but free meal for the staff with some entertainment, and that was really good too. Because it gave the parents a role in the healing process. The other thing I guess I'll add too is that communication is very valuable, and really as we help our students, we are trying to inform our parents of what the students' need is. And one thing that was a great asset for us, and it came from Chardon High School and from Geauga County Mental Health, was a tool called CBITS, and it's CBITS, Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, and it's a screener that we gave to every student. And parents could opt out of it, but every student, and we gave it periodically, and that gathered information for us that we could share. Because if all we do is wait for the student to come to us that needs help, we're going to miss out on a percentage of our students. So by using that universal screener with all of our students, and then doing it again 6 months later so that we can compare, that was valuable information that we immediately shared with parents. And with recommendations in many cases too. Here's what this score probably means. You might want to consider looking for this kind of assistance for your child.
Any other questions at this point?
Great. Hey there. Thank you so much for coming here and for sharing all your stories and all the work you've done on behalf of students and families. I wanted to ask, a consequence of a lot of the media coverage around school shootings has been a lot of stigmatizing language around mental health that has a disproportionate effect on people with disabilities. And I know that you all likely had students with disabilities in your classroom. I was just wondering, could you just speak to the impact that school shootings have had on that community in particular? And have there been are there any particular efforts you undertook to support students with disabilities in particular? Do you have thoughts for us about how we can do that more effectively?
Right now, I'm doing some work, and it formed out of Sandy Hook, and it's Safe and Sound Schools. Michelle Gay lost her daughter, Joey, and Alyssa Parker. And they actually have curriculum, and they're working with us in the state of Colorado to deal with the effects on special needs students and how we deal with that under situations. And it's that training piece, because up until that point, we deal with the general population, but within that general population, you have subgroups. And so again, it's that educational piece, the curriculum. What do you do? What happens when they need to get out of the building? How do you calm them down and this type of thing? So it's just educating them, but there's a lot of great work being done.
So at Forest High School, I didn't have enough counselors to do this, but we did it anyway, and I have one of my 5 guidance counselors specifically for our special needs students. And so every time that we have a screener very similar to what Greg was describing in his last response, and we also have threat assessment protocol that we go through. Anytime that we have a special needs child that is going through that screener, or we are looking at the threat assessment, that guidance counselor is the voice, the leading and guiding voice at the table with admin and with our school psychologist, and as well as we have been able to partnership with a entity there in Marion County that provides an outside trained counselor. Unfortunately, she's only with us for 2 days, and again, that's due to limited resources. But she is also a major voice with our special needs students because that's kind of an expertise for her. So that was a step in the right direction. There is still much work to be done, but already that particular counselor being the voice for our special needs students, and just reminding me as administrator, they are going to process things differently, and you need to have your finger on the pulse of that and never forget that. Has been extremely useful for me as a school leader, and I think it's beneficial for our school community. Again, I would like to see more research done and more in-depth protocol developed for special needs students during those moments.
Yeah, our victim was a special needs student. So the victim in my shooting was a non-diploma bound student, nonverbal, autism. And I think the net effect of that from the larger school community, really from our students, was a greater awareness of how that impacted not only him physically and the potential impacts emotionally, because he couldn't, and still to this day can't verbalize how that felt in one way, how emotionally he feels, and then how does it impact a classroom of students of about, at that point, 8 to 10 students, who some were verbal, some weren't verbal, but all of them non-diploma bound, which simply meant that their way of processing information was different than the majority of the students within my building. So it really prompted our students to start asking questions of how can we support not only the victim's family, but how can we support his classmates who might not really understand at the same levels they're understanding what just transpired within their classroom. So it really was a rallying call, an unintended consequence was a rallying call for our students to how can we support this particular group of students who are going through this recovery in a very, very, very unique way than the other 2,200 kids who were going through it. So I think it built a stronger community and awareness from our students in our larger community around special needs.
I'd say on the awareness side, we definitely, as far as drilling and training, it looks different. Whether it's a fire drill or an active shooter drill, we're very aware and we have those conversations. How do we need to modify this? And then for the training, our assistant principal and our school resource officer, as they're training students, will be very specific and come up with a specific training plan for our special needs students.
There was a question from a gentleman back here in the corner.
Okay. First, I want to thank y'all for being here today. It's been a really productive discussion, I think. Every Town for Gun Safety, AFT, and NEA recently released new guidelines for gun violence in schools and sort of active shooter drills. And I was wondering if y'all had a reaction to that report that just came out. I was just kind of wondering what you were thinking.
I wrote about this. You can read it at WashingtonPost.com.
And I responded to Mariah writing about it, so I'm in that also. And I'll just repeat basically what I said to her yesterday. There is a fine line between instilling fear in students and preparing students. And what is being suggested is definitely proactive for preparing students. And I'm pleased to say what is being suggested by those entities is what Marion County Public Schools subscribe to whenever we are under the situation where we have to have a monthly active assailant drill. We subscribe to all of those suggestions, and dare I say that it makes it somewhat easier to run those drills for our students. They have a level of trust with the admin and with the teaching staff that we are going to run drills with their mental health capacity in mind and with their health just in general in mind while still preparing them. So again, that fine line between instilling fear and preparing students needs to be recognized, focused upon, and part of the conversation at all times when school safety plans and legislation for the amount of drills that you have to do are put into effect.
I'm good.
And
I guess I have the last question. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see Frank and George there. I'm Ed Clark. I'm the Chief Safety Officer for Montgomery County Public Schools. Before that, I was with the Maryland Center for School Safety. And I just wanted to make a comment or observation about trauma to staff. And George, this sort of connects to you and Frank as well. 2 years ago in St. Mary's County, we did not have an active shooter event. We had a targeted act of a school shooting where a young female student was shot from behind and, killed. We were down there as part of our role to kind of help the school district there. But what we learned about, George, and this was, you cannot make this up. There was a teacher at your school who was involved in your school shooting, George. She was there that morning of the school shooting at Great Mills High School. She used her body and shielded her body to protect her students. She was right in the impact zone of where the school shooting was. You just can't make that up. And the reoccurrence of trauma to that event was unbelievable. The other thing that we learned, and we heard it mentioned here today, that there are challenges with the staff, short-term, long-term, and long-term. And when we met with the staff before the end of the school year, they were concerned about not having the support when they broke for the summer break. The other thing that we learned, that not all counselors are created equal, and that they needed that trauma-based counselor to really get them over the line. And I also thank Frank, as Frank spent time with Dr. Heibolt there, who was the school principal. Is Jake? Well, I don't even
There
do
he
that.
is.
So we in our role, we kind of connected, Frank. Jake, you can speak more to that, but George, the other thing, and Dr. Heibolt, there was a student teacher in your school who came this year, or last year, to Montgomery County Public Schools with a traumatic experience in the middle school where we had a student death, a medical emergency. And that young student could not overcome both of those events. She has since left teaching altogether. So we're hoping that she can get on the road to recovery, take a little time off, and get back to what she really wanted to do as a high-quality teacher. But it just shows the enormous impact these events have on people's lives, long-term, short-term, and in the moment. So thank you all for what you're doing and sharing this critical information to all of us. Good to see you, Dr.
Thank you,
Heibolt.
Ed.
Thank you.
I think that's a good place to wrap up the panel. Thank you guys all so much for sharing these really powerful stories.
Okay, thank you. All right, when's your flight?
6 o'clock tonight.
Running to the.